Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming along. Today we're going to look at recovering a looted past, repatriating African history through old artifacts, new digital technology, leading to new communities and new narratives in African history and culture. We'll start with old artifacts, things like this, which are old prints, sketches, and engravings of things that were reported to be going on the African coast in the pre-colonial period. These sketches can now be digitized and analyzed in great detail among many cultural observers. So we'll start with the old artifacts, but we're going to apply digital technology in several different ways to expand our understanding of these old artifacts. And this will lead, very importantly, to new kinds of communities. New communities that are both international in scope and interdisciplinary in nature, in order to make sense of what we can now share from the digital technology. Now, the new communities are themselves going to give rise to new narratives, because people who come in with different perspectives generally have a different range of interpretations of the available old artifacts. So this is the dynamic we're going to pursue, and then think about, in effect, new ways to relate that to each other. By that we mean digital technology is not just good for replicating old things, but also for sharing them in new kinds of international environments made possible by digital technology. Zoom technology, for example, now makes it possible to hold international meetings around a set of documents or historical narratives that have previously been only the purview of a few limited groups. But now, new narratives lead to new global conversations in African history and culture. So this is what we're going to pursue for a few minutes here today. New narratives lead to new global conversations in African history and culture. Let's take a look then at some of the digitization technology that has launched new understandings of African history. On one level, it looks simple enough. We have old documents and old books. They abound in rare book libraries throughout Europe and the United States, and in other parts of the world as well, in the Middle East, in Arab cultures, and in other languages that we've not even begun to read. Now, things in those books are very interesting. We'll look at them in detail in a moment, but they can be mapped on top of other kinds of things now available only through digital technology, and that is satellite pictures of Earth that can now be viewed by anybody with a cell phone through Google Earth. So we're going to combine getting access to these things in print with that digital technology available from space. Now, obviously, one important new field in African history has been launched with the close digital examination of the historical texts and their printed maps. Many of these printed volumes from the 16th, even the 15th century, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century had within them printed maps. And it's now possible to digitize those maps and share them around the world. This can start with individual travel accounts or encyclopedia and compilations like this one. These little books have fold-out maps, which are quite often several times the size of the book itself. The books have been studied for quite some time, but only recently have we developed the technology, the digital technology, to study the maps collaboratively. That is, across the world, across disciplines, across language traditions. We can now study these collaboratively in detail. It's possible to take a map from a book like that and georeference it to be placed on top of images taken of the Earth from satellites. There are hundreds of georeferenceable maps, printed maps, from the slave trade period, and these can be placed on top of images from space to make sense of where in West Africa things came and what was beneath these maps in geologic reality. If you georeference these maps and place them on top of things like rivers or forests or deserts, you can learn a great deal about what went on in African history and why it went on in particular places. It's possible to georeference and analyze maps of islands with even greater precision. And we can take maps from the 18th century, place them on top of georeferenced images from space, and learn a great deal, as we'll see. Scholarly research and teaching potential of this is enormous. Consider just one point on one map, for example. This is a map of a portion of the west coast of Africa, known then as the coast of Guinea, or later as the Gold Coast, and this French map is very revealing. We can zoom in on it at various levels and call up details just by focusing on a high digital resolution copy of the map. If you scan these maps in at 600 dots per inch, you can gain a great deal of knowledge just by being able to see things on a scale you couldn't even see if you had it in a map case in front of you or it were displayed on the wall. For example, take a look at this. This map displays Dix Cove. It's a map in French, so it indicates that it's a Fort Anglais. And it's something we can learn about on several different levels. First, seeing it as a map, we can ask, well, where did the map come from? Well, in fact, it came from one of these 18th century books, in this case, a French book, which had a picture of a castle on the coast, an image that was drawn. It was not a photograph. It was long before photography existed, but the image was very, very instructive because, among other things, it has a picture of what are gardens right down next to the fort. It also has an indication of the floor plan of the fort, which, if you read the text in detail, will tell you where the slaves were stored, where the food was stored, and what was being, in effect, transacted in the trade from this particular fort of the English called Dix Cove. Well, that fort still exists, and you can see it's a substantial structure. It, in fact, is a massive structure and one of only approximately 80 forts and castles built along the coast of the current country of Ghana, what became known as the Gold Coast, as part of the slave trade. We can see it from space, as I've indicated, on these Google Earth explorations, and we can dive inside it and, in effect, take a look around, inspecting its architecture, its drainage system, its edifices from the outside, complete with their guns, pointed for the most part out to sea. And then it's multi-level structures of dungeons and living spaces for the Europeans. The guns are pointed out to the sea for the simple reason that their biggest rivalry is not with the African powers, but with those who are coming to try to gain that same toehold for trade on the coast from the other European countries. So while the British may be in charge at this point of this very complex architecture and structure, which would have taken decades to build, they're not there uncontested. On the contrary, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese are all trying to unseat them and do so with regular military skirmishes. So these are military forts with an elaborate internal architecture and armaments to match. Armaments that have among them and on them indication of who forged them and for whom. In this case, King George, George Yarax, as it was symbolized in his insignia here. You see the G and the R indicating King George, the late 18th century king against whom the Americans were declaring their independence, George III, with all of his munitions pointed out to the sea. Other castles were even built on an earlier basis. In fact, this one came into existence, in fact, was started in 1482, and it represents the earliest standing European structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Others like this could be seen from the beach outside or from the oceans, and you can see how close they are to the ocean. This is the inside of Elmina. The Elmina fort was very important to the Portuguese. This one is the inside of Cape Coast Castle, and you'll see that that can be viewed from space as well, and a great deal can be learned about it. This is what the Africa Map Circle is starting to explore. So, with the digitization of maps and a new community of people called the Africa Map Circle that's starting to look at this, what kinds of new narratives might we expect? Well, we don't know for sure because it's just beginning, but it's worth looking into in detail. We can ask, who is the Africa Map Society and what do they do? We're all used to seeing African maps, at least portions of Africa as a continent. Often these are used in textbooks to illustrate things like the slave trade, but rarely are they studied. They're used as illustrations, as kind of generic wallpaper for a period in history. But new technologies now make it possible to look at these maps in great detail in reference to known geological and geographic details, things that we can find out from Google Earth, for example. What's happening is that detailed maps of the slave trade are now becoming a matter of immense interest because they indicate the kinds of things that must have been going on in Africa prior to the departure of slave ships for the New World. These can be laid on top of one another and on top of the Google Earth base and analyzed in reference to those geologic realities underneath them. The result is you can look at new features of Africa, or I should say, age-old features of Africa in a new way, like river basins and deserts, mountains and forests, all of which are rapidly changing in our climate circumstance. If you map some of the historical material on top of these geologic views from space, satellite views, you can learn a great deal, especially if you look at them in detail. That's now become possible. It's become possible because of the digitization revolution. These maps can be digitized and shaped in different ways to fit on geologic substrates, but also they can be blown up and expanded to read details barely legible in smaller sizes, and certainly not available to the general public because these are rare and fragile maps, which few people used to get access to. Now, however, with digitization undertaken in part to conserve these maps, these digitized images can be shared and examined by groups of people never previously having access to them. Take a look, for example, at what is being undertaken in the Africa Map Circle, a group of people internationally that have gotten together to share this kind of information and share their analyses of these maps. They're inspired in part by the work of Prosser Gifford, a professor of African history for a long time. He died recently in 2020, but he taught that our understanding of African history, in fact, all history, is shaped by two principal factors. First, the nature of the data we have available to interpret and discuss, and second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle to discuss it, discuss the maps, discuss the documents, and the like. That's crucial. First, the nature of the data. Second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle, as he called it, in the circle to discuss it. That's a key concept. Who's in the circle? Well, the Africa Map Circle is trying to expand the circle beyond those who had access to rare book libraries or map collections of a specialized type to a much broader range of historians, scholars, students, and the general public. The Africa Map Circle seeks to be inclusive, whereas previous collections were by intention exclusive in the sense that you needed to preserve these maps, and that meant that they were kept from the public largely and only displayed in certain occasions and under very controlled conditions. But what is the circle? Well, let's take a look at it. The Africa Map Circle is a very interesting new intellectual enterprise because you could argue that the African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline. It was circumnavigated long before the Americas, or for Australia, for example, or certainly for Asia and large parts of the Russian north, the Siberian plains. But Africa maps were made largely and created by non-Africans. Now, this is an interesting anomaly. The first continent, you could call it that, to be fully encircled and mapped, but mapped by those who weren't from the continent by and large. Therefore, African maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the beginning. What are the early maps? Well, in many cases, they're transcriptions of places and names for places that were used in the local language. In other cases, they're names applied from European traditions. But which European tradition? Well, it depends upon the European group making the map. So there's a hodgepodge of different names, sometimes referring to places, sometimes referring to kingdoms, sometimes referring to names of peoples. or associations of peoples, or federations of tribes. Other times referring to rather mundane things like salt pans and hard rock. These maps are multicultural to begin with, and they require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. They can't be understood from only one linguistic tradition, for example, nor can they be fully understood if we don't understand what a place name means in the local language. Digital technology now makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. This is what's new. The maps are old, but the technology is allowing us to do new things with them. The result is that the collaborative study of African maps can now provide a new paradigm for international and multicultural teaching and learning. This is very important because the techniques devised here are not just exclusive to Africa. They can be applied to any part of the globe with any linguistic tradition. The study of Chinese maps, for example, could be undertaken in the same way that we're studying now maps in the Africa Map Circle. Study of Arabic maps of Africa, could be included in the same kind of scope, and with great results. Let's see what its intentions are. You might well ask, well, what is it? And you could scan the QR code and find out for yourself. How can it help me? How can it help those I know learn more or teach about Africa? Well, check it out. Scan the code and begin to participate, learn more, and join in. The goals of the Africa Map Circle are pretty simple and can be outlined very quickly. First, to provide readily available public access for scholars and students to historical and contemporary maps of Africa. Second, to provide for educators and students at all levels of teaching and learning resources to use in their own research and their development of online curricula, with selected examples provided from the Africa Map Circle's own Explorations series. And 3, to inspire and encourage scholars and students to expand and extend and share these tools in developing their own online African history research and teaching in Africa, the Americas, in Europe, Asia, and in fact, throughout the world. This is the kind of thing that could facilitate the Chinese study of Africa, the study of Arab countries along the northern part of Africa, and their understanding in their own cartographic tradition of sub-Saharan Africa, their understanding of the Indian Ocean and the role that African traders played in the Indian Ocean. All of these new extensible research areas can be absorbed in what the Africa Map Circle is beginning to undertake. In the future, the Africa Map Circle will seek to provide a platform upon which to share scholarly research and novel instruction initiatives that demonstrate a creative use of maps in online teaching and learning about Africa throughout the world. So, join up, join in. The Africa Map Circle is something for the public in general to learn from and learn about. Under lockdown, which we've all experienced for the last year and a half or so, this has become particularly important because learning under lockdown has changed from the very basic levels of elementary school right up through colleges, universities, and graduate school, everyone's had to shelter in place and hunker down in a kind of new isolationism. Africa is a huge place, but we didn't learn much about it by going there during the last 18 months. Couldn't go there. Similarly, Africans couldn't come out from the continent and tell us, as they normally have, as exchange students throughout the Western world. That lockdown has meant there's been a kind of cutoff of the usual educational process. But we've devised new tools and developed some tips for online learning about Africa and the world during this lockdown. You can get in touch with some of these through the Africa Map Circle. At the African Studies Association last year, there was a special panel devoted to this. It's called Online Research and Teaching with Africa Maps, Tips, Techniques, Examples, and Resources. And it was put together by the Africa Map Circle, coordinated by them as one of the special sessions. It was highly successful, an international meeting, and in some sense it served as a proof of concept of what could lie in store for an even more ambitious effort. What can it do for students and scholars? Well, take a look at the online research and teaching that we managed to undertake during these lockdown times. Online research and teaching with African maps was a paper presented at the ASA meeting, and you can get access to it by clicking on the resources, scanning in the code, and clicking on the paper citation. So what we're looking at is bringing into a conversation with one another, not just old maps and digital technology, but new communities, plus new narratives in African and global history. How are we doing it? Well, largely through digital communications technology, not just the digitization of individual maps and the ability to send these by email or something like that, but the ability to explore them together with virtual seminar. This is what the African Studies meeting proved last year. We could hold a virtual international seminar with people from all over the world to take part in a Zoom session where things were shared online, real time with one another. Zoom technology is transforming all levels of education, and it's that technology that's being combined now with the digitization of African maps. Let's look at some of the 18th century maps then of the Gambia and Gore Island area of West Africa. Here's one of the best known ones by a fellow named Leach, Captain John Leach. Developed a map in 1732 of the Gambia River, which was quite detailed. We can take a look at it and demonstrate for you how it can be accessed online and studied by yourselves if you have an internet connection, a cell phone, an iPad, or a computer with an internet connection. Let's take a look at this particular map and also the map of the plan of the island of Gore, an island right off the coast of Senegal. So let's now take a look through the Africa Map Circle Digital Resources Directory, how we can look at some of these 18th century, 17th century, and 19th century maps of Africa and share them digitally across space and time. There are several libraries you can draw these things from, including the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, Stanford University Libraries, University of Illinois, Northwestern University, and a very valuable private collection entitled Afroterra. Their maps are perhaps the best organized in all of these different libraries. So let's take a look. We'll look for the map by Leach, a cartographer in the 18th century who made a map of the Gambia River that was very influential and quite detailed. So let's search the catalog for his name. Leach, Leach. Okay, we're going to hit go. And sure enough, 3 of the maps that are there are mentioned. One's in French, one's in English. Let's take the English one and take a look at it. If we hit on this, we'll see a small map indicated here in the little upper right-hand corner. Click for high resolution zoomable image is what it says. And sure enough, we can click that and get out to a zoomable image. And a zoomable image is one that will increase if you pinch it and spread it. And that's what we'll do, to look at the mouth of the Gambia here and examine what this map records. First of all, let's look at the cartouche. And the cartouche indicates it's a map of the river Gambia from its mouth to Arapina by Captain John Leach, 1732. Now, the cartouche are not photographs. They're iconographic representations, often quite fanciful. Here, for example, we have no idea whether these bow and arrow representations with the person on the left represent real bows and real arrows that were in use at the time, or whether that's just the generic equipment for a native. This is important to focus on because often the images are generic images intended to convey a spirit or an indication of a general cultural type. And often the cultural types are quite wrong. We have no idea, for example, whether elephants existed anywhere near the Gambia at this point, yet they're pictured here in the cartouche. They probably weren't visible and in evidence near settlements in the Gambia. But other things are far more precise and give indications that are quite interesting. You can here see, for example, up these different rivers, indication of Batik, Kingstown, or various functional spots like salt pans over to the left and the right of these different rivulets that lead to the ocean. Then an indication of broken islands, and then some annotations that are really quite interesting and very helpful, like this one. The towns marked with stars belong to the king of Barsali, and the other towns on the isle to the king of Bara. These islands and parts adjoining make great quantities of salt and produce most part of the rice used at the factories, the land being low and proper for that grain. Now, this is actually a very interesting piece of information. They're producing rice for the factories. What are the factories? Well, the factories are the European establishments all along the rivers that are gaining slaves and stocking them in this offshore island known as James Island. You can see here's the different factories. Chili factory, Abreda factory, FACT, and they go on up the river. The numbers in the river indicate the fathoms, or the number times 6 is about the number of feet. Fathom is about 6 feet. And here you get an example of an indication of the company's corn house. Now, that means they're storing corn, what they call corn, it's not clear from the map or from the usage of the early 18th century what is meant by corn, except it now seems that it's Indian corn introduced from the Americas. Other portions of this part of West Africa show plantations of Indian corn that are being dried and used and reconstituted in the foodstuffs for the Atlantic trade. Many have focused on the role of James Island. You can't see much from this map because it's in effect so small here, but this is the English fort. It's taken over by the English, I should say, during the time of James I, the same King James, for which the King James Version of the Bible is named, by the way. In any case, these are the kinds of details you can pick up from these maps, and they're very valuable assets for looking in detail at what might be called the first draft of archaeology of this area, if we can undertake the archaeology eventually. Let's take a look at the island of Gorée as well. Once again, we can go back to the directory in Afroterra and type in the island of Gorée, or if we know the map location, as I do in this case, it's map number 1093, and we can go right to it. There too, it comes up in the right-hand upper column square, and you can tap on that and get out to the zoomable map. The zoomable map is very, very detailed and interesting. It has an explanation. Although this is largely a French-dominated island, this map is in English, and the annotations are in English, giving an indication of what is where, all numbered, and an indication of what's supposed to be going on there, including the gardens, which are here, and an interesting set of huts up here numbered 42 and 43, which are worth investigating in detail. Let's look now at the annotations for 42 and 43. Here they are, 42. Convenient place for huts to lodge ye free Negroes. 43. Huts of ye Bambaras. Now, what are the distinctions of those on the island between the Bambaras and the free Negroes? Very interesting that it should be outlined in a map like this, and something that should be studied in detail, along with the date that this takes place. Indication of a slave booth, as well as where the troops are staying. And then an indication all along here of fortifications that haven't yet been built, but are intended. Fortifications intended. Very interesting. The English are keeping close tabs on this island because they too would like to occupy it. Well, these are the kinds of detailed maps that you can look at and start posing questions more than answering them. These maps are not an answer to the questions we have, but they force us to ask some significant questions of the other documentation available. Well, you can see why we began to think of the use of these maps as taking a step toward an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade, because these maps don't answer so many questions as they pose many, many more. They enable us to look at rivers, coastlines, and islands, and the long ocean voyage in a very different way than we were able to do so prior to access to these maps. And we can raise some troubling questions about how these ships, for example, were provisioned for hundreds of years to travel thousands of miles with millions of hungry passengers. Then we can ask the questions about the major structures left in Africa, constructed for the slave trade out of stone. These are in many cases named after kings. But as one poet put it later on in a very powerful poem, was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? This is the kind of question that can't help but be raised by the close study of these maps and the archaeology of the buildings left in the African coast. We're taking steps towards an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade. Prosser Gifford, as you will recall, emphasized that it was first the nature of the data we have available to us and discussed, and secondly, the range of people and perspectives that were included in the circle, as he called it, the circle which exchanged the information and posed the questions, and then tried to answer the questions. Now, the digital revolution has done two things, at least two things, in fact, many more, but it's made it possible to replicate these and distribute them, but it's also made it possible for new groups of people to get together in the circle to discuss them. That raised a whole series of questions that was put by the people who actually were never in the circle before. As you can see, the massive structures built in West Africa didn't build themselves. And often the history books are filled with statements like, the Swedish built this fort in 1650, or the Dutch built this fort in 1685. But anyone who takes a look at this on the ground and on the maps realizes that there are far too many to have ever been built by teams of Swedish workers coming down in boats to Africa, or boatloads of Dutch masons showing up to build a fortress. But no one asked that question. In fact, history books still record that the Dutch built this fort in such and such. Well, when you look at the perspective of these massive structures from the point of view of the workers, the poem by Bertolt Brecht is really very telling. Who built the seven gates of Thebes? As he points out in the second and third lines, the books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Not quite. This is why who's in the circle to ask the questions about these maps is very important. Prosser Gifford's point is crucial. It's true not just of these collections of maps, but of all the archival collections in European hands. The Balliol Historic Collections, a college in Oxford, has decided to expose some of these documents to the public in an exhibit next month, September 2021, entitled Slavery in the Age of Revolution. Consider this exhibit as an example of what one of Oxford's most prestigious colleges is putting forth as a resource for people to understand and enrich their sense of history. They put together a trailer on YouTube about it. There's no argument made in the trailer. It's a video essay, but a kind of invitation to come look at the documents held over the historic period of the slave trade, donated to the college by members of the college, by people who had studied there and have worked throughout the age of slavery. Take a look at their video presentation. The Balliol Historic Collections, Slavery in the Age of Revolution. As you can see, it contains documents about Haiti, forthcoming as an exhibition at Balliol Historic Collection Center in September 2021. Well, this is the kind of digitized material that can now be shared around the world. The presentations of these kinds of historically important maps and documents from libraries, museums, private collections around the world could now be discussed in the Africa Map Circle series of online sessions called Explorations. This is happening already de facto around the world. Here in the United States, these techniques have been extended and entire exhibitions can be presented and later explored on their own by users through interactive online platforms designed in conjunction with the YouTube Exploration series. This occurred, for example, at Harvard not too long ago. There was a group exhibition of the Harvard Hutchins Center History Design Studio, known as HDS, in 2019. They called it Footprints Across Time. It was a group exhibit of 10 different individuals who presented material about the legacy of the slave trade itself, the forerunners of the slave trade, and the impact of slave trade. It was very, very powerful, put together by graduate students with great skill. In this in-person and online exhibit, Installations included cartographic narratives from both sides of the Atlantic slave trade system, inspired by the work of Harvard professor Vincent Brown. He's a close friend of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., and Henry Louis Gates attended the opening ceremony and, in fact, endorsed the work. He was quite proud of it. You can get access to that exhibit material because they left up web pages that those who couldn't make it to the exhibit itself can see long afterwards, long through the COVID moment. One of the exhibits was entitled Maps, Stones, and Plants, Agents of Empire and the Ecology of the Atlantic Trade. It had a website to it, which you can get access to quite easily because the feature of this exhibit was that everything within it included a QR code. The QR code was something students knew right away what to do with. Faculty and professors needed to be taught, but you don't need to teach a teenager or a young adult how to use a cell phone. And one of the things they constantly use it for is to scan QR codes. This particular exhibit used that skill already present among high school students, college students, and graduate students, all of whom had cell phones or access to cell phones or iPads. And it used that skill they already have to engage them with documents that were original from the empire days in Africa. Each element in the exhibit included a QR code, which then linked them to the original material and allowed them to study it in detail. You can scan in this QR code and get to the website where that material is available for you to use. In fact, it's a general process going on now in all of galleries, trying to bridge the gap between gallery and reality and back. You can scan in the codes in most art galleries nowadays and get very much richer material than you can possibly pick up or carry while you are seeing the exhibit itself in the museum. Similarly, you can see how it's linked to other historical material, whether that material be from the slave trade period or from the Botticelli moment in Italian and Renaissance art. This is why history in the digital age has become something entirely new, with the communications capabilities of things like Zoom technology and QR codes. Cambridge Community Television used the QR codes, and it made it possible to communicate this material over the television to large numbers of people who could then be invited to see the exhibit. As every high school and college student knows, cell phone technology and instant digital integration through QR codes makes it possible to link in-person exhibits in galleries directly with their wider world across the whole planet. So if you scan in the code from a TV broadcast, or you learn about the Africa Map Circle from a TV broadcast, you can scan in the code. And it's as if you're taking notes on the whole thing and are able to get out to the original material. This is why African historical cartography is much broader in its scope than initially the maps themselves. You can combine maps available from Oxford, from Cambridge, from Harvard, from Yale, all of which have scanned in maps and have very valuable collections of their own, in addition to individual colleges at Oxford or Cambridge. So you can span oceans and bridge traditions to enhance our understanding not only of African history, but all of global ecological history. African history is intimately tied up with the ecological history of the rest of the world for the last 500 years. Since roughly 1492, it was in fact intimately involved long before that through the East African trade in the Indian Ocean and the North African trade and trade routes all the way through the Middle East and into Europe. In fact, it was across North Africa that most of Europe received its culture by way of Arab translations of Greek texts. In any case, these oceans and deserts can be spanned, and the traditions can be bridged with the newly available technology. In effect, in Africa, anyone with a video cell phone and access to the internet can now learn about African historical cartography. It may seem amusing to them at first, especially when the European maps are so wrong. Place names, for example, are often mistaken and don't mean what the Europeans were told they meant. This is why some people find it humorous to hear Europeans talk about this, but that's because they have an expertise that neither the Americans nor the Europeans have, namely a knowledge of the local language, which was what the Europeans were trying to encapsulate when they first put labels on these maps. So these individuals have a great deal to laugh about, but also a great deal more to contribute to the study of African history and enrich our understanding of the maps now accessible through things like cell phones. As historical cartography is made more and more accessible to cell phones, it will have the potential to change cultural awareness all around the world, whether in the Western world, in Asia, or in India. This has now become a vehicle for learning about other cultures. African historical cartography is therefore a lot more than just old maps and digital technology combined. In fact, it affords the capability of new communities to be created nationally and internationally across all disciplines and all perspectives. This allows for the possibility of new narratives in both African and global history. But wait, there's more. Much, much more, especially when it comes to non-maps that are graphics. Because in addition to maps, there are related historical drawings, prints, engravings, lithographs, etc., a whole range of graphic material. Then there, of course, there are news illustrations. As the mass press develops an interest in Europe in the scramble for territory throughout Africa, there's a fascination on the part of the public for illustrations from news reporting around the world. And then there's pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial photographs, from postcards to published reports and personal snapshots. So all of these things, historical drawings, prints, engravings, new illustrations, and photographs, are part of what needs to be taken into account. Digitizing these other graphic and photographic resources for the study of Africa can now be organized on an international scale, and this has begun with the African Historical Graphics Archives. It's the long-term goal to expand this beyond any one country to as many countries and traditions as possible. One of the projects of the African Historical Graphics Archives in the digital humanities has been to look at the range of maps concerned with the slave trade from 1556 through 1823. It's a digital humanities project that looks at graphics much more than the quantitative study of text. So, as an overview of the components of the African Historical Graphics Archives, we should keep in mind that it includes maps, that's where it started, and prints, and illustrated news, and then photographs from both pre-colonial, colonial, and potentially even post-colonial circumstances throughout Africa. Let's look at this boundary line, though, between maps and prints. What's the difference between a map and a print? Well, it would seem straightforward, but it's not always straightforward because of the ways in which things were printed during the slave trade, for example. Consider this. Is it a map or a print? Well, if you look at the top part of the engraving, it's clearly a print. It's the prospect of Bent's Island and Fort, as it's indicated here, from Smith. Well, Smith is a source that's being cited by this engraver, and you can indicate very clearly from the page that it's a British fort with its guns pointed outwards. But if you look at the bottom of the page, it's no longer a print, it's a map. And in fact, it marks a lot of very interesting items, including a fortress that you can see from above now that you saw from the side before, with an indication of the slave house, the garden, the kitchen, the apartments, storehouses, the parade, and what's called over on the left, the Orange Walk. Very interesting idea. Growing oranges was a big issue, an important issue in the source of vitamins for those officers on the transatlantic ships. It's also an indication of the old town and the new town, and very importantly, the well. Crucial resource for any marine operation is how do we get enough fresh water to last the crew and, in this case, the passengers of slaves that we're taking to the New World. Well, the Bent's Island seemed to be well equipped in all of these things. And it was so well documented by several different traditions, in this case, the French, made a map of very similar proportions. In fact, they probably based it on the English map and made it available to French mariners, but also probably the French government, because French were very interested in unseating the British from their various toeholds in the enclave economies they created and protected through these forts. As you can see, the guns are pointed out to the river in this case to protect themselves from the attacks of people like the French who wanted to take over this little toehold as a trading post for the trade in slaves. So you get a very interesting rendition, and even major structures, not just small fortresses up rivers, but major structures on the coast are represented in a similar manner. But once again, you can ask, is this a print or is it a map? Well, it's both, obviously. It's a print that contains maps. It contains a map on the lower left that's an insert here, which is a floor plan of the coastal castle, in this case, Cape Coast Castle itself. And up in the upper right-hand corner is a map that's even more interesting, and we'll look at it in a moment. But you can see by blowing these up digitally, you can start to discuss them and study in detail what's going on, in this case, inside the fort. You've got an indication of the various components in the fort, the gateway, the warehouses, warehouse yard, apartments, Watergate, Grenell Point, or the Green Hill Point, as it was put, number F, which is a kind of lookout point. And then the barracks and rooms, number G. And those are somewhat ambiguous. Is that where the slaves stay? Is that where the crew stays? There's no explicit designation of where slaves are put in this castle. H is the square tower. I is indicated as the chapel. Now, this is very interesting. There's a chapel in the midst of this slave trading castle. There are also then platforms for 13 guns along that major side of the ocean, where they're protecting themselves potentially from invaders who wish to take over this castle as well. So there's a lot of detail there, but even more detail is provided up in the upper right-hand corner by the insert map. Here you get an indication of the size of the castle itself in number A, and it's quite a bit smaller than the grounds, and in fact what are called the Cape Coast Gardens. Very interesting rendition there on this map of the Cape Coast Gardens, as well as Phipps Hill Tower, the Upper Walks, the Garden House, Coconut Walk, Watercourse, Crosswalks, and once again, the Orange Walk. Oranges are very important, as we learned from the Bent's Island map. Even on a small island like that, they had planted orange trees. Here, there's substantially greater number of them. And way down at the bottom is the way to Ye Salt Pond. Well, what's a salt pond? Why is it needed here? Well, think about it for a moment. There are large portions of this population that has to be provided for with rather substantial gardens, several times the size of the fortress itself. And if they're eating anything that spoils, it needs to be salted. This is true not only of the residents of the castle, but the residents that are being held in the castle for sale to these ships off the coast. Now, those residents sold to the Europeans and bought by the Europeans to be put on these ships and taken to the New World also have to eat during the 6 to 8 weeks it takes them to make the trip across the Atlantic. This gives a new significance to what are called these gardens, Cape Coast Gardens. They're in effect a plantation, in this case in Africa, run by slave labor prior to their embarking on slave ships. It's the existence of these prior plantations in Africa that really makes it possible for the slave trade to get going. A substantial food supply has to be generated to provide for millions of people over hundreds of years, going thousands of miles in thousands of ships. Now, the study of these prior plantations has not yet been taken seriously, or in depth, I should say. People who studied it do it seriously enough. But we haven't begun the archaeology and ethnobotany that's needed to understand what went into the production of food for the transatlantic trade. The more we learn about the transatlantic trade, we're impressed by the numbers. But what about the logistics? What about feeding all of those people? What about, in fact, creating these forts, right? These forts don't build themselves. They're constructed, and it's often attributed to Europeans for having constructed them. The British built this, The Dutch built that. The Swedes built this. In fact, this one was first laid out by Swedish engineers in 1653, but later came under the control of the British and was under the control of the British during the time of the American War for Independence, what we call the Revolutionary War. So it was slaves being exported from here that made profits that enabled the British to raise an army and oppose the American colonists. Well, when you look at these global aspects of history, you learn quite a bit. And one of the things we want to do in greater detail from the study of these maps is look at the ethnobotany of these prior plantations. Here we need some serious help from what has not yet really been funded or begun, and that is the detailed archaeology of the prior plantations in Africa. So there are a number of components here then that are maps, prints, and illustrated news. As we say, there's some confusion between what are maps and what are prints because they can be both. The same is true between prints and illustrated news. There is a distinction, but it's blurred for a while. It has to do with the speed of communications. In the 19th century, there's a shift over several decades from sailing to steamship operations. And this means several things, but among others, it means that there's a more regular and periodic visitation of the coast by trade and military that can get to Africa more quickly and more dependably on a schedule. News can actually be reported back in a certain amount of time from the west coast of Africa and isn't subject to the vicissitudes of sailing. Steamships carry mail. In the process, news is more and more demanded by those in Europe and in London, say, for example, in the English-speaking world, that want to know what's going on in the colonies, especially as they're being asked to do more and more and pay for more and more in colonial ventures. The scramble for Africa heightens the interest in West Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and news reporters go out to comment upon what's going on in these areas and report back to a news-hungry public. These are often accounts that are accompanied by illustrations. So illustrations come to be a major component of the graphics record of the 19th century. You can see it in things like the Illustrated London News, which is what? Well, it tells you. Basically, it's a weekly that shows up and it's sold for 6p. And in this case, it's sold for the issue of March 21st, 1874 on a Saturday, and every Saturday it provides the London news-hungry public with illustrations from what's happening around the world in the Illustrated London News. In this particular case, what we have here is the representation of an invasion by the British force, combined force of both Army and Navy moving into villages in this part of West Africa and doing something rather disruptive. The Illustrated London News is not the only one out there. In fact, a paper called The Graphic also publishes itself every week and starts to have a correspondent to cover what becomes known as the Ashanti War. In August 9th of 1873, for example, their edition included 2 images that came out from this part of West Africa. Part of it looks like buildings. The other part is interesting because it includes very little detail about the buildings, but quite a bit more about people. In the Ashanti War reporting, there is an indication of that same castle we looked at in the 18th century, about 125 years earlier. In fact, more than that, it's about 150 years earlier, and this is 150 years later from the engraving of Cape Coast Castle that we looked at earlier. But it's a substantial structure. It didn't go anywhere in the intervening 150 years. It's right on the coast, but it wasn't washed away. And in fact, it was reinforced several times right during the American Revolutionary War in the 1750s and 1760s, finishing up the restoration in 1775, the same year that the shot heard around the world from Concord, Massachusetts, was shot. The British finished the renovations of what had been previously a Dutch fort, built initially by the Swedish, in order to, in effect, conduct the slave trade. But 150 years later, they're using the same structure to launch their invasion of the interior, known as the invasion of the Ashanti War. Well, beyond looking at the buildings, what can we learn? What about the lower part of the graphics page on the 9th of August, 1873? It's a fascinating image, one that has a lot of detail in it that should be looked at in careful digital expansion. We don't have the technology right here, but it is now feasible to expand this and look almost at every individual that's represented. We can do, in a sense, a blocking out of things we'd like to learn more about, especially from the African historians who know about them. But let's learn what we can, at least, from this image from 1873. How should we interpret this illustration? Well, we're told right away that in its title that this is Ashantis buying muskets with gold dust at Assini. The definition of this picture is pretty blurry when you try to blow it up, but we could get better images of it potentially and look in greater detail. What we learn is quite something, but you got to ask, is this news? The fact that Ashantis are buying muskets with gold dust is not news. People have known that for 150 years. Why does this correspondent feel that this has to be told in 1873? Well, because the Ashanti are now engaged in a war and they're using these muskets against the British troops. So you can see why the editors, if not the reporter, the graphic, probably wanted to generate a picture like this to give people at home a sense of what's going on in the Ashanti War. News, news, news in some sense, but is this image really a news story? Or is it something else? Is it, for example, propaganda? Well, let's look at it in detail. Okay, we're told that it's Ashanti's buying muskets with gold dust at Assini, and sure enough, there are some muskets being bought by people whose gold dust is being weighed out with gold weights, which the Ashanti and other Akan peoples are very famous for. So they're paying for it, and this is imaginatively a representation. It's not a photograph. It's very important to realize these are not photographs. These are images, and therefore they're interpretations by artists. They're not presentations, but representations, that is, representations of what's going on locally. And for that reason, as representations, they resort to iconic symbolism to indicate, in some sense, a visual cliche. Well, the visual cliche here is that the gold is being weighed in exchange for a musket, while a wife or sister or elder woman looks on with a baby on her hip. What else is going on? Well, not mentioned in the title, but clearly foregrounded in the picture is one gentleman pouring a liquid into the mouth of another gentleman, and the presence of somebody who seems to be asleep altogether, perhaps from the influence of this liquid. Can't tell from here, but it looks like a liquor of some kind, and they're enjoying it, or at least imbibing it, and perhaps sleeping it off if they've had too much of it. What's going on here? Well, kids are watching a newly acquired musket be inspected by the new owner who's trying to figure out how it works. And they're fascinated with the whole thing. More drinking seems to be going on in the background, as it was here in the foreground on the left. But in this case, it's being done by women, bare-breasted women at that, who seem to be engaged in chugging whole bottles at a time. Here again, we have more children interested in rifles and somebody discharging a rifle and presumably trying to figure out how it works and how it shoots, while another person is loading it with the ramrod necessary for these kinds of muskets. These are the kinds of muskets sold to the Africans well after their utility in European wars. These muskets were abandoned long before in European warfare, but they're the kind of thing that characterized the American Revolutionary War, and they're sold on in 100 years later in Africa as something that's exchanged for gold dust. Well, back here, there's another kind of exchange that seems to be going on between women and a merchant who's holding up what looks like a kind of cloth. And there are other women trying on or trying out various kinds of cloth, looking at it, assessing it. And one woman smoking a pipe here, which is quite interesting in itself. There are other people smoking pipes. There's another woman over here smoking a pipe. So you get the representation of the addictives here on the early trade frontier, the alcohol, right, the tobacco, and the firearms. ATF, right? Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. That's all you need on an early frontier is to trade in addictives so that your trading partner will want to come back because he's become either physically addicted to things like alcohol and tobacco or socially addicted to having firearms as a means of social survival. So addictives are a prominent part of early trade, and they're well illustrated here, even though the trade may be going on primarily in cloth, and as it turns out, probably indigenously fabricated cloth. The narrow band weaving is a weaving technique used in West Africa for centuries, and very valuable cloth is produced for local sale between merchants, who then also carry, as you can see on the wall here, European muskets for sale for gold dust on the Ashanti war effort, or I should say in the Ashanti war effort in trying to resist the British invasion. So how should we interpret this? Is this news or is it propaganda? Well, it's kind of propaganda, as you can refer to as image fixing. It fixes in the minds of viewers an image that's very important and hard to unseat because you don't realize you've absorbed it. Yes, these people are clearly traders, both in cloth and in gold and in guns. They also enjoy drinking, right? Maybe to excess. This is something clearly that the artist chose to put in here. And in many respects, their children are interested in these firearms. And in fact, the adults, in some sense, are represented with the children as kind of infantile in their fascination with these new technology instruments, which, as every European at the time knows, are over 100 years old. And it's only children that are interested in this kind of thing. Well, you can see there's a load of information involved in image fixing in the minds of a readership that's just beginning to learn in the illustrated news each week what's going on in the colonial frontiers. That image fixing is a very important part of 19th century illustrated news. Very different kind of imaging than went on during the slave trade period in the 18th century. This becomes dominant in the 19th century, especially as the competition for European conquest of West Africa and East Africa and South Africa comes to a boil in the scramble for Africa. So you can ask, where did this come from? What does it mean? But if you start to analyze it, it's more subtle than just being a print. It's not just a print, it's a kind of illustration, an illustration that veers over into propaganda. It doesn't just illustrate iconic representations of the gold trade, the cloth trade, muskets, alcohol, and tobacco. It's saying something about those things and the way people are behaving in reference to them. So it can be said to be a form of news that's trying to inform and create opinions at the same time. Same is true, obviously, of other images from the Illustrated London News or the Graphic, or increasingly Harper's Weekly in the United States, which sometimes takes over these images and prints them from the London press directly. They usually strip the name of the artist, but then they print them to the American public for imagery. And it's very clear in these images that some people are in control, others are using threatening force, and those locally are trying to get away from them, either protect their children or protect their valuables. This is not food coming out of this pot. This has to do with valuables like jewelry and gold. And sure enough, there were pieces of jewelry and gold that were appropriated, stolen, looted, use whatever terms you find appropriate for the acquisition of these things as a result of the Ashanti War. The British inflict the humility upon the king of Ashanti, forcing him to come and kiss the boot of the European commander. And afterwards, as we're told in this imagery, it's very interesting that they would include something like this in the Illustrated London News or the Graphic. The items that have been appropriated or looted are sold, apparently to other troops or to merchants who show up. If you look at it, the fuzzy character of the image is not helpful, but you can see it's the sale of loot, Sir Garnet Wolsey, in the auction room. Now, Sir Garnet Wolsey is the man who led the Ashanti invasion of 1873, 1874. And he's overseeing the auction of the loot. Very fascinating. So these are the kinds of images that start to emerge, maps, prints, and news, but there's more, particularly photographs. And there's a very interesting fudging of the line between illustrations and photographs. In some cases, you'll see it's an echo. For example, take a look at African Historical Graphics Archives that has colonial photographs. There are new studies coming out almost every year now on the history of the colonial photograph. But you can learn something by looking even at just one. First of all, you can learn that these things are posed, right? Because the photographic technology is not itself very well advanced, it can't capture motion very well. The shutter speeds are too slow. So people have to pose for particular renditions that they want captured. Who is in the picture, how they're standing, how they're arranged is absolutely crucial, especially in things like this. You can ask yourself, how are we supposed to understand this photograph? Well, one of the things you got to understand about it is that its meaning comes in part from the fact that it's a postcard. A postcard, right? This isn't an official photograph going into the archives. This is a postcard put together from the collection of ETWC. This is a particular photographer who is selling these photographs to the European officers, who then send them back from the front to their friends and relatives back, in this case, in France. This is le chef de bataillon, Nogues, the commandant of the region, the commander of the military force in the colony de la Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. Well, this is just one photograph, and we don't have the resources here to go into the full collection of colonial photographs, certainly. In fact, no one does, because we're just assembling these photographs, digitizing them, and trying to make them available for those who can study them in greater detail. Even at this stage, though, it's understandable that images like these from Africa's past evoke strong responses all over the world, not just in Africa. Marchand is heading up, in effect, a scramble of the French for territory in the Sudan. And people like Cecil Rhodes are presented in ideological, kind of fanciful imagery bestriding the whole continent of Africa in the tradition of the statue of, in Greek mythology, of the on the island of Rhodes beside the port. He's holding a telegraph line, which represents part of what he had as an ambition to connect the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo by way of a telegraph line, the imperial lines of control. So these are well beyond photographic and just iconographic representations. They're ideological representations, and they evoke strong responses, not just, as I said, among Africans, but anybody who experienced colonial rule, which was a great portion of the world's population in Asia, Southeast Asia, even in China, and all of Latin America. In fact, you could argue that in our day, the legacy of these images has triggered international social activism, even among Rhodes Scholars in Oxford. Now, Rhodes Scholars were set up, and their scholarship was set up in the trust or behest or will of Cecil Rhodes. And Rhodes Scholars have been the primary beneficiaries of that over the years, selected to go to spend time in Oxford colleges, where Rhodes himself had been trained in Oriel College, Oxford. But Rhodes Scholars are getting nervous about that these days, and they're starting to protest, suggesting that Rhodes must fall. What they're pointing to is the statue of Rhodes on the High Street, on the exterior wall of Oriel College, where he had been a member, that had been erected by people who venerated Rhodes's contribution to the British Empire and to Southern Africa. So the Rhodes Must Fall movement has begun to be generated, among others, by Rhodes Scholars themselves. But the controversies continue in the debates amongst the Rhodes Scholars. Some are arguing that this is much too small a way of looking at the world. They are suggesting, in effect, a new kind of perspective called the overview effect. You can catch up with this if you're interested by scanning in the QR code and following the debates. But some of the people are pointing out that In considering why roads must fall, it would be unfortunate to become too distracted by statues alone. We need to look instead at the far more dangerous reification and permanent institutionalization of extractive industry and petro-dependent agriculture that everywhere marks the enduring legacy of European imperialism throughout Africa and across the world, well beyond Cecil Rhodes's brief historical moment in southern Africa. Don't become too fixated, they're arguing, on the material statue. It will fall eventually anyway. Look at the legacy. What should be done with these kinds of images and historical records? Should they go the same way as roads must fall? Should they be torn down, burned, or ripped up? Well, maybe not. Why? Well, because they have valuable information about the arrogance of European control and conquest in the imperial moment. What should be done with the looted colonial treasures, taken from the hands of those who are trying to protect them in these areas, if we're to believe this illustration? Or from the known objects that show up in the British Museum, which we can actually see not only in photographs later on, but in the showcases of the British Museum. Well, we know what happened to them in the first instance. There was the sale of the loot, as it was called, Sir Garnet Wolsey in the auction room. Nowadays, should this loot be auctioned again, this time without Sir Garnet Wolsey in the room? The question is being raised throughout Africa and the wider world. Colonial loot is a big theme in all of the history of Nigeria, particularly among the Benin people whose bronzes were captured by the British and then seem to show up in both French and German and American museums. As you can see in these articles you can get access to through Transition Studies and these webcasts, there's a discussion of art, loot, and empire, focusing particularly on the Benin bronzes, and leading to the wider discussion. And a book entitled The Whole Picture, The Colonial Story of the Art in Our Museums and Why We Need to Talk About It, by Alice Proctor. In effect, what can Africa recover from its looted colonial past? Well, as it turns out, this question will be examined soon, thanks to the scholars of the University of Cape Coast Department of History. Why is that? Well, because this year, on the 19th of July, they issued a call for papers entitled Repatriation in Africa, the African Diaspora, and Other Global Contexts, Histories, Practices, Understandings, and Constructions. Very interesting theme for a range of papers they're calling for in order to hold a digital worldwide conference online. It'll be fascinating to see this because it's being evoked from the University of Cape Coast College of Humanities and Legal Studies in the Faculty of the Arts. This isn't an engineering meeting. It isn't a meeting about art historians. It's a meeting about the history department. Now, as it turns out, the University of Cape Coast Department of History is an ideal group to initiate this international conversation. You'll remember the role of the Cape Coast Castle in the 18th century slave trade and the role it played, and told to us by the Illustrated London News, in the invasion of the Ashanti region in 1873 and 1874. Furthermore, you can learn from the African Historical Graphics archive of colonial postcards that illustrate not just the Cape Coast castle, but the other castles all up and down the coast of Ghana. And there were some 80 of them over the course of several hundred years that during the colonial period became used for other reasons. In this case, the export of bags and bags of cocoa illustrated in these postcards. In this case, produced by the French and sent back by people in the Gold Coast. So, the Department of History has taken an important new step here under the Faculty of the Arts. It, in fact, has announced in a bold new invitation this conference and invited people to join from all over the world. Images, as we mentioned earlier, exist in the university libraries in Cambridge, in Oxford, in Harvard, in Yale. And in effect, they could be invited to join in this kind of exchange because it's a digital conference to be held online. The initiative of the Department of History at the University of Cape Coast then deserves the support of a globally connected community of African studies scholars in this major new initiative. In this manner, the faculty and students at UCC could substantially advance the international conversation on repatriating African history in the months and years ahead. Furthermore, with digital technology, it can be made available online. And through QR codes, students can scan it in from all over the world, all over Ghana, and in fact, all over the continent of Africa to participate in this kind of conference. This then provides a partial answer to recovering a looted past. It may not be possible to regain some of the things that have been expropriated or in fact destroyed, but there is a possibility of repatriating African history by combining the study of old artifacts with digital technology, extending this to new communities, and having that generate new narratives in African history and culture. There will be new narratives, as we can see already in the past few years. The study of the Benin art, for example, has gone through several phases. You can see that repatriating African history stimulates debate. It doesn't foreclose it, it expands it. The British Museum has actually published a piece on the Benin bronzes and cultural violence. In addition, other books have come out on the Benin plaques. And all of those things have stimulated the wider discussion, as we pointed out, called the whole picture. This is the kind of new narrative that can emerge from new communities. And it can do so because of new technology. Zoom technology is what's intended by the University of Cape Coast later this fall semester. And in fact, it'll be very interesting to see how it emerges, because new narratives lead to new global conversations in African history and culture. And they will, over time, generate new understandings, something that deserves support and continued participation of the international community.